specific to questions, thanks everyone. I think it worked out awesome having everybody sign in and sign up for the seminar and submit their questions. We've got over 30 questions here. We think we're going to cover a bunch of these questions during our presentations. Questions about electricity loads and commodities, infrastructure, renewables, contracts. Everyone's concerned about budgets and costs and how do I take advantage, or what are the opportunities that we see on the horizon, something that CES looks forward to a lot. So we'll probably get to many of these. There may be things we can't fully answer today because we just don't know. There's a lot of uncertainty right now. But as we follow through on the other seminars of our stay-at-home series, we're going to talk specifically to folks in Maine, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, New Hampshire, and Connecticut, and then we're going to wind it all out with a seminar that's focused on sustainability, where we're going to talk more about meaningful electrification, talk about what the future load profiles and consumption patterns are going to look like as it relates to carbon mitigation goals and renewable infrastructure. So more to follow on this stuff. We decided to keep these to fairly short to not take up everybody's entire day and allow you to check in as you saw necessary on our additional follow-ups. The agenda is we're going to walk through an overview of the COVID-19 impacts. We're going to touch on each of the commodity markets for oil, propane, and electricity as it relates to the New England market. We're going to sum up some takeaways, and we're going to take your questions and answers. So with that, I'm going to hand this off to Andy.
Thanks, Keith. Hello, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us today. Our numbers are looking pretty good. It's great to have so many people able to make it. My name is Andy Price. I'm President of Competitive Energy Services. We're celebrating 20 years in business as of last year. And one of the highlights for me since I joined Competitive Energy 19 years ago in 2001, every year has been this seminar series. Of course, it's been a highlight primarily because of our ability to interact directly with you. This year is significantly different and difficult for many of you. We appreciate that. And we're going to do our best here with this virtual format. One of the casualties of the virtual format is going to be the post-seminar cocktail hour, which has become a bit of a tradition. We're certainly going to miss discussing energy markets with you over a beverage. We'll trust that you'll carry that on tonight yourselves, and I hope you have more success than I do interesting your families in the nuances of energy markets. Before I move on, I do want to highlight for you that Competitive Energy is at 100% capacity with all of our staff working remotely from home, and we're entirely focused on helping each of you navigate pretty turbulent energy markets, as well as pretty uncertain usage situations in your own facilities. So please don't hesitate to reach out to us. We are here to help, and we really do like to be helpful. Most of you are pretty familiar with us already. I'll do a brief introduction. Competitive Energy is a full-service energy advisory firm. We have very empty offices in Portland, Maine and Topsfield, Mass, and some very crowded home offices in every New England state. Our clients are across the United States and Canada. All of those clients, like yourselves, are end users, consumers, and that's very much by design. We don't work for suppliers or generators, and that is so that you can have every confidence that we are always 100% supplier neutral, product neutral. We offer procurement services for just about every energy commodity you can imagine, as well as discrete consulting services. Today, our consulting business is heavily focused on renewable energy, energy master planning, climate action planning, greenhouse gas tracking, battery storage, and similar initiatives. For our largest clients that have procurement needs as well as consulting needs. We're often packaging together those services that are most relevant, along with budgeting and variance tracking, and we call that our full service category. Our procurement work definitely benefits from the expertise we develop on the consulting side of our operation, and the reverse is certainly true as well. Our consulting work is greatly benefited by the expertise in forward energy markets that we have gained from 20 years of procurement activity. So this is something that we think really sets CES apart. Review is really impacting energy markets in some very significant ways. The first thing we're going to look at is the impact on gasoline demand across the United States. Oil markets have been much in the news and obviously very impacted by COVID-19. What you're seeing here on this chart is gasoline demand in the United States over the last 4 years, 2017 through 2020. And we're showing it for the first 16 weeks of the year. That's January through mid-April. And what you can see is that demand across those years has been remarkably consistent at about 9 million barrels per day. That's 400 million gallons per day. But something happened in mid-March, and that demand was cut roughly in half. Of course, what happened was travel restrictions and stay-at-home orders across the United States. As we'll talk about throughout the presentation today, this very dramatic impact on gasoline markets and oil markets more generally has had some ripple effects into other energy commodities. The next market we wanted to look at a high level was electricity markets in New England. And what you're looking at here is April electricity usage for New England, again, for the same 4 years, 2017 through 2020. But there are a number of questions when people registered, not just about overall energy usage direction, but also profile. So we thought we'd show you this profile across the hours of the day. So you see across the bottom, hours 1 through 24. And each line indicates the monthly average hour usage for that hour. So the bottom line there is 2020, and you can see that usage is certainly depressed compared to historical years, but the profile is relatively the same. Maybe a little bit less usage early in the morning, but otherwise not too dissimilar. What has happened is that usage is down about 4% compared to 2019, about 8% compared to 2017 and 2018. So some significant decrease in usage, but nowhere near as significant as with gasoline and oil markets, and perhaps a little bit less of an impact there than you might have expected. Of course, none of your businesses operate on the average. So what this slide is showing you is the impact by economic sector. This isn't a slide that we put together. This isn't a graph that we put together, rather, but we thought it did a good job showing relative magnitude of impacts for different sectors. What it's showing you is the percent change between electricity usage between the first week and the fourth week of March 2020. And it's pointing out the obvious that certain businesses have had really dramatic reductions in usage, while others have had small impacts or even seen usage increases. And what we wanted to highlight here really was that in addition to lower energy consumption, it's the increased usage uncertainty across these sectors that is having impacts not just for you as consumers, but also for suppliers. Of course, it also introduces some opportunities, and that's something we're going to try to highlight for you today as we go through each of the sectors. With that, I'm going to introduce Chris Brook, who is our Director of Natural Gas and Energy Services, to talk a bit more specifically about oil markets. Chris?
Thank you, Andy. And thank you, everyone, for joining today. The major story in oil is that demand destruction due to the COVID-19 is causing peak storage and negative prices. This next chart we're going to look at here is looking at U.S. crude oil stocks and NYMEX prompt month futures pricing. The blue shaded area represents the 5-year range of oil in storage. The dark blue line is the current year's storage levels. You can see there's some seasonality to that, as you would expect. The red line is the WTI prompt month, which is the underlying commodity of the NYMEX oil futures contract. Now, we all know that crude oil traded in negative prices last week, which is a clear warning of just how scarce storage space for oil is getting. Prices below zero are the market's way of telling producers to stop pumping. And the storage problem didn't start with COVID-19. If you go back to end of February, beginning of March, world oil storage concerns started with the Russia-Saudi Arabia oil price war. And that's when Russia refused to reduce oil production in an attempt to put U.S. shale producers out of business. The delivery point of the WTI oil futures contract is Cushing, Oklahoma. When the WTI contract expires, traders who are long receive oil in Cushing and must find a place to store the barrels or ship them out. So how did we get to negative oil prices? Well, people left holding that May contract last week when it settled. They would have been required to take delivery of oil at Cushing. There's nowhere for them to store it. So they had to get rid of that obligation. And so they were actually paying off takers to accept the oil. That was cheaper than shutting down or eventually starting operations back up. The storage crisis has arisen because there is still simply too much crude being produced in a world that can't use it. The traders have even resorted to ocean-going tankers to store crude in the hope of better prices ahead, and even pipelines. So some dormant pipelines that are being used to store crude as well. Because of these tankers being used for storage, shipping prices are surging to historic levels. So the industry is running out of tankers, and that's a sign that how distorted the market has become. Now, in an attempt to alleviate some of these storage issues, the OPEC Plus alliance will join output cuts starting May 1st, slashing output by 20% or roughly 10 million barrels per day. Prompt month oil futures marked their third straight week of losses last week and have fallen for 8 of the past 9, with WTI off around 7%. Crude is currently trading at about $17.50 a barrel as I speak. This next slide, we're now going to take a look at U.S. crude production and the rig count. The gold line is the U.S. oil rig count, and that's important because it's the best indicator of how the U.S. industry is reacting to the storage crisis. So the rapid drop in the number of oil rigs in operation, which last week fell to a 4-year low, as you can see, the recent history is that they were trending down due to prior to March 1st, but they fell off a cliff as COVID-19 started unfolding. The ULSD and gasoline prices are near 20-year lows as demand falls and refiners face storage issues. So U.S. oil refiners processed just 12.4 million barrels per day last week. Now that's the lowest amount in at least 30 years except for hurricane-related events. And of concern, and something that we're monitoring closely is that over the past week, Marathon and several producers, but Marathon announced it would stop production at a plant near San Francisco, and Shell has idled 3 U.S. refineries in the Gulf Coast region. But like I said, this is happening to several producers. So it is expected that global refineries could halt as much as 25% of total capacity in May. In addition, as production rigs are going offline, future prices for associated liquids such as natural gas and propane are increasing as they rely in part on supply sourced from oil production. The longer-term oil outlook is steadier for now. The outer months are in a classic contango market, which is to say that futures prices are higher than spot prices or physical market, as prices are expected to rise over time as the demand returns. So the key takeaway here is it's a good time to consider looking at future open positions if you haven't already done so. Thank you.
Great, Chris. Thank you. Just a reminder to everybody to make sure you've muted your microphones here. I think I was hearing somebody typing in the background, so just to double check on muting yourself, please. Chris, we are in a crazy and dynamic time here as it relates to oil. You did a good job of summing it up. My takeaways were we see this low price, we see this falling rig count. As we look out into the future, it's we're not sure where this is headed. Likely demand reduction is going to continue to erode or keep prices low. But I look at this and think if I could fill my tanks today, I would. If there was a possibility to lock in at some of these lower prices, I would. What are some other takeaways that I should conclude with here?
Yeah, no, that's a good summary, Keith. But in addition to the tankers being used for storage, there's actually a flotilla of super tankers carrying about 43 million barrels of Saudi oil headed our way. This is going to add to the growing congestion at the U.S. ports in the next 2 to 4 weeks. And of course, this is at the same time producers are shutting in output as they run out of space to store unwanted supplies. So for context, producers need approximately $23 to $36 a barrel to remain profitable. And oil is trading at 17 and change today, as I mentioned. So the number of production companies that are going to weather this storm really depends in large part on the pace of economic recovery. So even though it's a good time to look at locking in open positions as prices are attractive, regional suppliers may temporarily have difficulty securing physical contracts until that volatility settles a bit.
Right. And if prices don't rebound to some degree, a bunch of these folks are going to be ended up out of business. Thank you very much, Chris. And with that, I'm going to hand this thing off to Charlie Agnew, Managing Director of Energy Services. Take it away, Charlie.
Thanks, Keith. And following Chris's mention of the drop in operational oil rigs, I wanted to take just a look at what's happening in the Permian Basin of West Texas, where we've seen about 20 rigs per week coming offline in the Permian since early March due to this glut of crude oil in the region. And these are wells and rigs that are not only producing oil, but other liquids and natural gas as well. And we've seen an average decline in natural gas production as a result of about 2% from this region since early March, and have an expectation that this trend is going to continue through the remainder of 2020. And again, as a result of that, we've seen some price support and movement in these forward gas prices resulting from that expected decline in production. Storage is also a component of the U.S. supply balance, given the seasonal demands for gas, for natural gas for heating. And the spring, summer, fall are typically injection seasons where we're building inventory, which is then drawn down during the winter months. Our current inventory levels are about 20% above the 5-year average. And this is in part due to the short winter we had, but we're keeping a close eye on this because we're seeing storage utilization levels for April that are nearly double where they were 1 year ago. And it'll be interesting to see, if if and how quickly these curtailments in production do affect our storage levels as we go into the fall. So from a pricing perspective, similar to oil, we are in a contango market where we expect to see continued weakness in the front month spot and futures contracts. The summer prices have stabilized to some extent here, and as I mentioned before, winter and forward years have been boosted by these expectations that we'll be seeing lower production through the rest of 2020. So for the gas commodity, both near and long term, we want to keep a close eye on whether some of these market forces do balance themselves, or whether we might head into the fall with overwhelming storage levels ahead of winter. Interstate pipelines and ability for natural gas to flow into New England, does also have a great impact on gas basis prices, as you all know. And our proximity to the Marcellus Shale is a wonderful thing. But movement and constraints in New England pipelines has been a story we've been telling for a while now. And just to highlight the two directions where that gas travels out of the Marcellus. First is east through Connecticut and Massachusetts and into receipt points south of Dracut, Massachusetts. And second is west out of the Marcellus through the Dawn Hub across Canada and down the Portland Natural Gas Transmission System, or PNGTS. A couple of the projects to highlight that we're watching now are the final stage of the Atlantic Bridge project, which includes an upgrade to the Weymouth, Massachusetts compressor station, expected to be completed November 1st or by November 1st, and that will allow bi-directional flow of gas both north and south through Dracut. In addition to that, Portland and Westbrook Express projects along PNGTS are also expected to increase capacity and are on track to be completed by the end of 2022. Wanted to make another note of change that's resulted from depressed world liquefied natural gas prices, LNG, over the past couple of years. We've seen Repsol, who's the owner of an LNG terminal in Canaport, New Brunswick, loading more gas into the pipeline instead of just during these peak winter days. And that's really helped to alleviate winter basis price volatility. And overall, these couple small incremental pipeline expansion projects and additional baseload LNG injections have really helped to flatten spot and forward winter basis prices. But none of this should make everyone feel exceptionally calm, because we still are subject to market volatility due to these constraints on the peak winter days without any new large expansion projects in the works.
Hey, Charlie, thank you. So once again, my key takeaways are that basis is fairly flat here, but these futures, we've seen these before, right? Over the course of the past decade, we've seen NYMEX natural gas futures touch on this $2 range, and then they typically rebound. And so what's going to happen here over the course of this next injection season is going to be very interesting. Charlie, what my takeaway is, I would monitor this market and have a strategy, and to the extent that we can, look to take advantage of both, near-term spot pricing as well as dips in the market going out into the future. But what else do you see there in terms of what the average person can do here as they look at this market?
No, that's exactly it, Keith. The short and long-term effects of COVID are that we do expect continued weak prompt month and spot market prices, and longer term we expect some stabilization as the economy gets back into gear. So it's as simple as that, but that's a good summary.
And also, as it relates to the basis, to the pipeline piece, I heard that there's some incremental smaller additions coming on, but is there any large expected expansions here in New England as it relates to transmission, gas transmission?
None on the near term, Keith. So that was my point. Is we still can expect the winter volatility during the coldest days of the year.
Great, Charlie. Thanks. And an excellent forecast on what we're going to see with electricity with Zach Bloom, Vice President and Head of Sustainability and Renewables. Zach Bloom.
Thanks, Keith. Yeah, so when it comes to electricity, I think the general assumption is that as commodity pricing decreases related to COVID-19, that procurement opportunities have presented themselves. So let's unpack this a little bit. First, there's kind of two ways to view this. The first is more the real-time wholesale market, and the second is related to futures contracts. So let's dig into the wholesale market first. As we know, the price of gas and electricity have a very high correlation, given how much natural gas is used for power generation. And so since that gas cost is declining, we expect and have seen that actually show up in our electricity pricing. One of the things that Charlie and Chris also mentioned was low-cost oil and LNG, which is really what's used in the wintertime when we have that peaking issue and it gets really cold out. So between those three, what we've seen is a much lower electricity price. And so the chart here that we're showing looks at LMP or locational marginal pricing. And LMP is really a proxy for kind of hourly spot pricing. So the dark blue bar is the winter average, and the light blue is the summer average. And the last is the red line, which is really looking at the average annual price. So as you can see over the last 10 years, really 2016 had been the market low on the annual basis. And that was driven by an abnormally warm winter, which lowered commodity prices, similar to what we're seeing now, huge storage builds and lower prices. So in that year, it was $29.76. And if you look at the summer of 2019, that was about $24.23 for NEMA, the Northeast MAF zone. So it's 22% below the 5-year summer average. What you can't see here is what we're doing so far in 2020. And so just this winter, so similar to the blue bar, we're seeing $26.69. So that's 45% below the 5-year average. And really it's lower than pretty much every other period here that we're looking at besides 2016. So the next piece now is really what's the future contract look like. So what we're showing here is really kind of 3 separate strips for future pricing in 2021, 22, and 23. And so all 3 of these are really at kind of 2-year lows coming out of the mild winter. But that drop really started in January, pre any impact from COVID. And all 3 were kind of going down in tandem, albeit 23 was a little bit higher. What you can see though is as of March, when COVID really started to kind of exacerbate, what we're seeing is 2023 is actually on the upturn, while the others are still relatively flat. So it's a long way of saying that we're really not seeing huge drops from recent changes in the market, but we are still at very low points here for commodity strip pricing. So that's the energy piece. The next piece is really about fuel security. And if you recall 2 seminars ago, Andy talked about the ISO New England Grid Reliability Study from back in January 18. So one of the main outcomes of that study was that in really cold winters, when demand spikes and power generators draw off their existing fuel supply from on-site storage, the grid reliability was really pinned to fuel security issues, so not having enough fuel available on site. So let me just give you a quick timeline here. Going back to 2018, after that study was released, Exelon announced plans to retire their Mystic station in Boston, and ISO concluded that Mystic's closure really posed an unacceptable reliability risk for the New England grid. And so in December of 18, FERC had approved an out-of-market fuel security contract that would prevent Mystic's retirement, and that's going to go into effect in June 22. It's going to run for 2 years, and the estimated cost is about $200 million per year. So about $1.66 per megawatt hour. Then in August 2019, FERC approved an interim market solution referred to as the Inventoried Energy Program. So that's really covering the winters of 2023 and 2024. Those costs are between about $100 and $150 million. And so about $1.04 per megawatt hour impact. Now, just this month, ISO kind of proposed a tariff change to FERC that would implement a long-term market-based fuel security solution, which is being referred to as ESI, or Energy Security Improvements. That would go into effect in June 2024. Now, it's important to note that there are no exemptions from this. Unlike some of the RPS at state level programs, you cannot avoid these costs. If you're in the market and you purchase electricity, it's socialized across everyone, so you can't avoid it. The ESI aim is really to improve regional fuel security by adding reserve products to the day-ahead market, which will in turn optimize generating resources. And that is expected to kind of proceed in perpetuity here. So end result is, over the next 3 years, we would expect a premium for these fuel security programs to be anywhere from $1 to $2 per megawatt hour. And then in 2025, when the first two roll off, we would see anywhere from a high of $1 to a low of about 30 cents per megawatt hour. And that's because it's really variable based off of how much fuel needs to be acquired, which is based off of how warm or cold the winter is. So that's kind of a high level on the fuel security piece. As Keith mentioned at the outset, there's one more piece here that's kind of a glaring hole, which is the RPS, the renewables. Just wasn't enough time to cover this, given how variant each state is in what buckets they have and what those costs are. So we'll get into more detail on those in the state seminars. So the last piece to kind of round out the electricity discussion is the forward capacity auction. So, what we're looking at here, the recent FCA 14 auction occurred here in February, and that's for your actions in 2022 that would impact the 23-24 commitment period. So they cleared at the lowest clearing price in the history of New England's FCM, which was about $2 per kW per month. So if you go back here to 2017, assuming you had a 10 megawatt load, it would be about $1.7 million. And now your actions from this summer would put you at, closer to like 700, 800,000. And then in the future, that lowest auction that just cleared 2022, now you're down to the $300,000 to $400,000 range. So what you can see is there's a huge drop off in what those capacity costs are. And you should see that, all else equal, show up in your retail electric rates. Now, it's important to point out here that just because the FCA auction rate is lower, doesn't mean that a lot of the ISO programs that you've participated in for DR across the board are going to be lower. So one thing to keep in mind is utilities are actually running their own DR programs, and those can be quite lucrative still. So definitely want to just point out that it's still valuable what your actions are now and in the future, not just, take the foot off the pedal. So last piece here I did want to kind of touch on, though, is what is the impact for the summer 2020 planning. So one piece just to keep in mind on the FCA auction rates are, they have been low. and we expect them to stay low until a lot of these generators actually retire. And one of the things that might result is, a little bit quicker pickup in that action of retirement, assuming commodity prices stay lower. That's going to mean there's less money available for existing generators, and the less efficient ones, or the ones that have higher commodity costs, will now be kind of forced out of the market, over the long term. So that when it does occur, likely will bring the FCA rates back up. So getting into kind of this summer, Andy referenced at the outset, we'd seen anywhere from about a 4 to 8% drop in ISO and New England usage. And so what does that mean for this summer? As a starting point, what we're seeing now isn't what we're going to see in the summer, because we have a lot of these stay-at-home orders. So right now, all the states in New England, at least by the end of May, assuming no extensions are put into place, should be lifted. So as of June, stay-at-home orders will be gone. That doesn't mean we're going to get back to business as usual right after that. It'll be a kind of slow build back up to that. So, what we've seen thus far isn't necessarily what we're going to see in the summer, but early indications are that, at least from the 2020 summer peak, that we're going to see a flatter load, and that curtailment periods might be extended from what we normally ask you. So less of a 2-hour or 3-hour window, and likely more calls than you've seen from CES for self-help in past years to be able to go after that. Now, the last two pieces here, and I mentioned it a little bit earlier, is the utility DR programs. They're still lucrative, and they should be proceeding as planned. The final point here is that ISO New England's demand response audits and the event response, should proceed as normal. So those are kind of two separate pieces. The first one being, you'll still be called upon for your audit. So if your operations have changed drastically and your load profile is, significantly lower, please reach out to us or your ESA rep if you have any specific questions on how the audit might be impacted by your operations. The last piece there is more about, an event response. So if there were an OP4 event that were called, you'd still need to be ready. I think it's unlikely, given the decreased load, that we would see that, given what our existing capacity in New England is, but that'll really unfold as operational changes start to become more evident.
Good, Zach, thank you. I think one thing I definitely heard from you just now is that the likelihood of more peak curtailment events is inevitable. We've had it, I guess, pretty good here for the past decade. When you think about the peaks were relatively clear in most cases, but going forward, we're going to be asked to curtail more. In terms of the market, the near-term gas and basis being lower has definitely translated into lower electricity costs. I hear you that FCM is still a very important component. How you treat FCM within your electricity contract and how you manage demand on campus is critical. And that not all of the contract terms, as we look at these specific supplier contracts, are the same, and those need to align with your capabilities, your goals, and what you plan to get out of that contract at the end of the day. That said, one can take advantage of the utility programs, self-help programs. Any other things that people need to be watching out for over the course of the next year to year and a half?
Yeah, I mean, for some of those future contracts, we're talking about these programs, for the fuel security, and these are, our estimates that we're providing for what the impact is. Individual suppliers will, likely put a premium on it just to be conservative. And so I do think it's important, if you have old legacy contracts, none of these programs were really conceived. And so whether it's in your transaction confirmation or a modification to your base agreement, you need to be very clear what's included in your contracts, what's passed through, and similar to the RPS, are they able to pass through additional costs? Is it, fixed and guaranteed, or can it be modified based on changes to the market? So it's definitely one thing where suppliers are kind of out there trying to figure it out as well. So the farther out you go, I think the less certain it is. That last one, the ESI, not many people are pricing in, if at all. So I do think you want to be a little bit careful, depending on how far out your hedge is, to be aware of what's fixed and variable truly in your contract.
Sure, that definitely makes sense. So that concludes our portion of the presentations. We're going to now, it's your time to ask questions. Again, a bunch of people asked questions in advance of this thing. I thought I would pick off some of the important questions that I noticed. And the first one that I had here, I'm going to ask Andy to talk to us about this, is what's going to happen now to all these solar projects that are in the works around New England? CES obviously is working with many clients for solar projects in Maine and Massachusetts and other states. What do we see as an outlook going forward here?
Yeah, it's a great question. We're actively involved with 30 or more solar projects throughout the region. And I think the one thing that we can say with certainty is that the answer is very complicated. It depends on a number of factors. Projects that are in early stages, that are in the permitting and planning and design stages, are proceeding ahead with no significant impacts to date. But the developers clearly have a lot of uncertainty around restrictions associated with availability of equipment, availability of labor, and how travel restrictions might impact them when they get around to construction. We are active on some projects that are actively under construction today because a lot of these larger solar projects are being built outside. It's one of the few activities that you can do safely social distanced. But beyond those sort of obvious impacts, there are a number of other things that longer term could impact solar projects. Things like availability to financing and capital markets. To date, those have continued to work in large part because a lot of the projects that we're involved with are supported by state programs, and so they're perhaps viewed as safe. But these projects rely to a significant extent on something called tax equity, and as we move forward in time and perhaps there's less available tax appetite for people to monetize those tax credits, that could have an impact on projects going forward. But again, we haven't really seen that yet. Finally, global supply chains are complicated things. Today, everything we do is very interconnected, and it doesn't do you a lot of good to get 95% of what you need. If any piece of it is coming from a plant in China or Taiwan or someplace far away and it's not available, that can slow you down or significantly delay you. So far so good, but I think everybody is pretty cautious and recognizing that there's a considerable amount of uncertainty here, not just with physical construction, but with financing as we go forward in time here.
Yeah, sure. That totally makes sense.
And just to add to that, Keith, I think on the renewable side, I touched on a little bit with the capacity, with lower commodity prices means lower electricity prices. For some of those large utility projects at a national scale where you're dependent on effectively that L&P price, what you're likely to get is less revenue than you were expecting, which means the value won't be as high as it might have been in past years. But it also gets to the other point, which is as less money is available, a lot more of those kind of on the border power generators might not be able to make it work. And at some point will be forced out of the market. And that will be a positive impact because that will take out those higher costs and allow more generation to come from renewables and compete.
Right. So another question that came in, which is one that CES has been getting a lot for the last month, is what will I save? I wonder how is COVID shutdown gonna affect my costs? And this is a great question. Many people are looking at, campus shutdowns, manufacturing shutdowns, and thinking, oh geez, I just dropped my electricity consumption by 25%. That must translate to a 25% reduction in cost. So it's important to point out here that they're not a one-to-one correlation. Because of tariffs, because of contract language, and because in gas contracts we're often bound to specific volumes that need to get liquidated in the market, there isn't a one-to-one relationship between reductions in consumption and reductions in cost. That said, I have seen a lot of data. We have been looking at a lot of our customers, real-time metering, and now we're starting to see the first round of utility bills come through. And this is a very general number, but between something like 45 and 15% reductions in electricity, and about half of that in gas, so as little as 10%, because it's been still relatively cold and buildings are still being heated and people are still putting into place different restrictions. There's a number of things that one needs to think about when shutting down, but certainly looking at your supply contracts and understanding how those are be affected by your reductions in consumption are important. If anybody ever needs any help on forecasting real-time reductions in cost as related to their commodity and consumption procurement, please reach out to us. We have a model. It basically takes your budget, works it backward, and it's a pretty good way to forecast. We're monitoring that in real time and adjusting it as we go. So that is something that is an important thing to be thinking about as we look at costs associated with shutdowns. Another question that we received here is, how will COVID impact natural gas infrastructure? So we need to break this down a little bit here. And so when I think about this, I look at it both regionally, nationally, and globally. And so we already talked about a lot of this regional piece. There's not a whole lot of regional transmission infrastructure that's coming to New England. That's been a long time story. That doesn't really change, and that's not the story to be thinking about here. We do think that it's possible that we could see delays with the utility, but just like Andy talked about on solar project, it has to do with permitting. It has to do with people about working rules and all of those other components that are related to shutdowns. So I think it's realistic to think that local utility projects will probably be delayed in some way, shape, or form. The bigger story is really nationally and globally. And so Andy was talking to me a little bit about an article that he read in Platts, and I thought I'd let you elaborate on this, Andy.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, I think I agree, Keith, that nationally what we're seeing and what is I'm sure everybody else is reading is significant capital constraints. These are the large oil and gas producers and the small ones as well. They're all significantly cutting their capital expenditures going forward. Some of that was reflected in the rig count information that Chris showed, but as well as pipelines that are planned and other large infrastructure developments. They're all on the chopping block. And I think the article you're referring to, Keith, one particular pipeline developer had 13 active pipeline projects, and they had cut 11 of them. They're moving forward with only 2. So this has long-term impacts in terms of availability to not only produce the gas associated with the rig counts, but also transmit it to regions of the country where demand is highest. So these impacts will be felt even if demand comes back for a significant period of time.
Great. Just interesting that globally, if you look around the map here, landed LNG price ends up right around the same, pegged at around $2, whether you're in US, Asia, or Europe. And so you have to ask, where is LNG going here as we look out into the future, and how does that affect future project expansions? Charlie, I have a question that came in here for you, but it's that I think you'd be good to answer. Could you explain how these declining electricity prices are going to affect some folks that have these NEB contracts, the credit projects for solar?
Yeah, I can do that, Keith. So there are a variety of net energy billing programs throughout New England, and I think this question is maybe geared towards Maine, where we have a net energy billing credit rate that is indexed in part to supply prices for electricity. And so just as that, for using that as background here, I think the first and obvious response here is that, declining electricity prices will have, a great effect for those that consume electricity. And there's just an obvious benefit in declining electricity prices. So, with respect to energy billing credits, where those credits are indexed to what would be a declining supply price, the benefits of participation in those programs may be lesser. And, all the modeling that we've done has projected lesser costs for energy in the coming few years relative to the past few, and that was even pre-COVID. But certainly we've gone through a readjustment of overall or underlying supply costs. As noted in the presentations today, we're expecting that there will be some cost recovery over time as things get back to normal and back to business. And, in addition to that, there are these regional programs that Zach mentioned, as well as state programs for RPS and renewable portfolio standards that are going to start layering costs in year after year over the next decade. And so we do expect that benefit to, again, appreciate over time.
Sure. And the lesser savings is inevitable here, potentially. CES has been very conservative in our estimates. And I would point out that what Charlie described here would also apply for Massachusetts. So, for Charlie, thank you for that one. Another question might be a good one for Andy or anybody else here. If demand continues to remain low at these lower than historical levels as we head into the winter, what will happen with as the cold season demand for electricity and for heating generation? Will this look the same as it has in previous years?
Yeah, I'll take a first pass at that, Keith. So I think Charlie highlighted how high natural gas storage levels are. It looks like we're going to finish the summer injection season probably pretty close to full. So we're very comfortable in the natural gas supply situation, more comfortable than we have been in past years. But here in New England, as everyone's very familiar with by now, the issue is really getting that gas, and it has been for a number of years, getting that gas into New England on the peak days when there's just not enough pipeline transmission to satisfy power generation as well as heating requirements. That's still going to be the case. And so if we get a very cold winter, there's not enough natural gas pipeline capacity. And so power plants, electricity generators can't use the gas. It's all used by households who are to heat. What might be different this winter, however, is if we continue to have low oil prices, and as you mentioned, low worldwide LNG prices, that's going to help keep a cap on that volatility, because that oil and LNG can be used as a backstop. So still potential for some significant volatility this winter, but perhaps less than the historic extremes that we've seen given low oil and LNG prices.
Great, thank you. So at this point, we are at the end of our hour. We want to stick to that hour. We had a few more questions, which we're staffed, prepared, and ready to answer a few of. I have them teed up here, but for those that need to sign off, the hour's over. I just want to highlight a couple of final points here, that we will have these additional state-specific as well as the final sustainability presentation occurring throughout the month of May and into the first week of June. The specific dates are there. You can find the signups through our web links. If you have any questions, please follow up with whoever you have been contacting, communicating with at CES, whether it's sending your comments to Casey or to your ESA rep or whomever else you're comfortable with. I'm sure there's going to be a lot of questions. Hopefully we can incorporate some of these slides and talk more during our full service meetings towards in our other customer meetings. Was there anybody else here on the CES staff that wanted to just add a comment? If not, I'm going to just take a couple more questions here, as I think it's okay to just hang on for a few more minutes. Okay, interesting question here is, how is proposed offshore wind coming online going to affect the fuel security conversation and the necessity of the fuel security?
Yeah, I can take that, Keith. I think the fuel security piece, as part of that study, one of the things that they said was in the outer years, as more of that offshore wind comes online, that will reduce that fuel security risk. And that's really because, I'm getting an echo here. I don't know who's on, but I think what the general kind of thesis is what we're getting from wind is a lot more in the winter and nighttime when we need or have that gas constraint, opposed to something like solar in the wintertime wouldn't really help reduce that. So I think, long story short, the offshore wind would actually reduce that fuel security risk, but I think there's also some risk in delays in timelines where it might not come on as quickly as originally thought due to federal permitting issues.
Great, Zach, thanks. And then one more here. This is going to have to go back to one of the slides here. So with the what drove the drop in 2019? This is the low drop here. It was about the same as in 2018 before 7 a.m. Was that solar production? And we'd have to go back up in the slide deck and kind of see what that's describing, but we can do that. Anybody want to take that, Matt?
Sure, I can jump in. Can you hear me okay?
We can hear you great, thank you.
Great. Yeah, I think this came in from Dave Chamberlain. Hi, Dave. That reduction you're starting to see in 2019, a portion of that is probably solar. I mean, over the years, that sort of duck curve shape that we're seeing in New England has become more and more pronounced as more solar comes online and generates during that middle part of the day when the sun's shining. I think I'd be cautious before saying it's all solar in the year-over-year changes there, just because April is such a volatile month in New England, as we all know, weather-wise. I think, especially this April, I think we've all been feeling like it's been chillier than normal. But for that reason, there's a lot of factors that are weather-dependent that drive what we see for demand in April, and I think short answer is solar is definitely a part of it, but may not be the whole story.
Sure. So I think that really kind of rounds out all the questions that we had. If I can we can leave the mic open here if anybody wants to offer up any last minute questions. We're glad to cover those. Otherwise, we'll see it for the next one. All right. Well, thanks so much to everyone for joining, listening, for offering your questions. And we had some great participation here. Hopefully we've covered the issues that people are looking to hear about, and more to come. Enjoy your weekend. Take care, everyone.